You remember your first day of school. You remember an embarrassing moment from 7th grade. You can probably still feel the exact sting of your worst heartbreak. But the first 3 years of your life, the years when everything was brand new, when every single experience was happening for the very first time, are just gone, completely erased. Why? This isn't a minor quirk. This is one of the strangest facts about being human. You lived through thousands of days. You laughed. You cried. You learned to walk, to talk, to recognize faces. Your brain was working harder during those years than it ever will again. And yet you kept none of it. Not a single clear memory survives. So the question isn't just interesting. The question cuts right to the heart of what memory actually is and why your brain decided those years weren't worth saving. For a long time, people assumed babies simply weren't experiencing anything meaningful. Philosophers called infants blank slates. Early psychologists treated childhood as a kind of pre-conscious fog. The assumption was that if you can't remember it, it probably didn't matter much. But that assumption turns out to be completely backwards. Babies are not experiencing less than adults. In many ways, they are experiencing dramatically more. Here is what's actually happening in the brain of a 1-year-old. Every second, roughly 1 million new neural connections are forming. That's 1 million per second. The brain is essentially on fire with new information, building frameworks for understanding faces, language, gravity, temperature, safety, and danger all at once. So the problem isn't that nothing is being recorded. The problem is something much stranger. The recordings exist, but the playback system hasn't been built yet. Think about that for a moment. Your brain was storing experience without yet having the architecture to retrieve it consciously later. In the 1980s, a researcher named Patricia Goldman-Rakic began mapping the development of the prefrontal cortex, which is the part of your brain that sits just behind your forehead and handles complex planning, self-awareness, and long-term autobiographical memory. Her work revealed something critical. The prefrontal cortex is one of the last regions of the brain to mature. It's still actively developing well into your mid-20s. But even in infancy, it is nowhere near functional enough to encode the kind of memories you can later sit down and narrate to someone. The hardware for storytelling your own life simply doesn't exist yet. But this only explains part of the puzzle, because children do start forming lasting memories somewhere around age 3 or 4. So what flips the switch? And why is the cutoff so consistent across almost every human culture ever studied? The answer involves something called the hippocampus. The hippocampus is a small, curved structure deep in your brain that acts like an index for memories. It doesn't store memories itself, exactly. It connects them, tags them, and makes them retrievable. Think of it less like a hard drive and more like the table of contents in a book. Without a working table of contents, the chapters might still be written somewhere, but you can never find them again. In infants, the hippocampus is undergoing a process called neurogenesis, which means it is rapidly generating new neurons at an extraordinary rate. And here is the twist. That rapid growth is actually the reason memories don't stick. New neurons flooding into the hippocampus disrupt existing connections. Every time new cells arrive, they essentially shuffle the filing system. Memories that were indexed get re-indexed, then re-indexed again, until the original location is impossible to trace. Researcher Paul Frankland at the Hospital for Sick Children in Toronto demonstrated this beautifully. His team showed that if you artificially slow down neurogenesis in young mice, the mice suddenly retain early memories they should have forgotten. And if you artificially increase neurogenesis in adult mice start forgetting things they should have been able to remember. The forgetting, it turns out, is a direct consequence of the growing. Your brain was too busy becoming itself to remember what it was like before. That's a strange and almost poetic idea. You forgot your earliest years because your brain was in the middle of constructing the very thing that would eventually allow you to remember anything at all. But there's still another layer here. Because memory isn't just about neurons and hippocampal indexing. Memory is also deeply tied to language. And this is where things get genuinely counterintuitive. You don't just remember events. You remember stories about events. When something happens to you, your brain doesn't save it like a video file. It saves a compressed, edited narrative version. A story with a beginning, middle, and end, with you as the central character. And to tell a story about yourself, even internally, you need language. You need words. You need the concept of a self that persists through time. Babies don't have that yet. A 1-year-old doesn't have a stable sense that there is a me who existed yesterday and will exist tomorrow. The self is still being assembled. So even if an experience registers, there's no narrator yet to file it away as something that happened to you. Psychologist Catherine Nelson spent decades studying how children begin to form autobiographical memory, the kind of memory that says, "This happened to me in my life at a specific time." Her research showed that this kind of memory only becomes possible once children develop what she called the narrative self, which is essentially the internal storyteller. That internal storyteller typically comes online somewhere between ages 2.5 and 3.5. Before it exists, experiences happen, but there is no one home to file them under my life. So when people ask why you can't remember being a baby, part of the answer is, there was no you yet to do the remembering. The you that tells stories about the past didn't exist. It was still being built. Now here's where this gets genuinely strange in a modern context, because none of this is unique to humans. Infantile amnesia, which is the formal term for this gap in early memory, shows up in rats, mice, dolphins, and several species of birds. Every animal with a sufficiently complex hippocampus goes through a version of this same forgetting, which tells you something important. This isn't an accident or a design flaw. This is ancient. This is conserved across hundreds of millions of years of evolution. Your ancestors needed this to happen. Why would forgetting your earliest years ever be useful? One compelling theory is that rapid neurogenesis early in life gives you a brain that is maximally flexible. A brain that isn't locked into early patterns can adapt to almost any environment, any language, any climate, any social structure. The cost of that flexibility is early memories, but the benefit is a brain that can become whatever its environment requires. You traded your baby memories for the ability to become fully human in whatever version of human your particular world needed. There is also a darker and more practical reason. Early childhood is when you are at your most vulnerable. You are almost entirely dependent on your caregivers. You have very little ability to control your circumstances. Many of the experiences from those years are frightening, overwhelming, or painful, not because anything is necessarily wrong, but simply because you are small and the world is large and you don't understand most of what's happening to you. Some researchers have suggested that clearing the slate from those early years actually protects your developing psyche from being permanently colored by fears and confusions you were too young to process. In other words, the forgetting might be mercy, not a failure of the system, an intentional reset. But wait, does any of it survive? This is where the science gets quietly unsettling, because the answer is yes, some of it does survive, just not in the form you expect. The memories from your early years don't survive as conscious recollections, but they survive as something else. They survive as emotional templates, as reflexes, as deep, wordless patterns in how you respond to closeness, to abandonment, to anger, to warmth. The work of attachment theorists like John Bowlby showed that the emotional dynamics of your first 3 years shape the fundamental architecture of how you relate to other people for the rest of your life, and you have no conscious access to where those patterns came from. They're just there, baked in, running quietly underneath everything you do. So here's what's true. You don't remember being a baby, but your body does. Your nervous system does. The part of you that tenses up when someone withdraws affection or melts when someone holds you safely. That part of you was formed during the years you can't remember. Those years didn't disappear. They just went somewhere you can't look directly at. They became the walls of the room you think in, the water you swim through, the ground under every memory you do have. And this is the part that should genuinely stop you in your tracks. The years you remember least are the years that shaped you most. The foundation of your personality, your attachment style, your gut responses to fear and love and trust were all laid down during a period you have zero conscious access to. You are, in a very real sense, a stranger to the most formative chapter of your own life. There's something humbling about that. Something that should make you curious about the people around you, too, because they're all carrying the same invisible architecture, shaped by years they can't explain or examine, playing out in relationships and choices and fears they often don't understand either. Memory feels like the story of who you are, but the deepest parts of who you are were written before you could read. You remember your first day of school. You remember the embarrassing moment, the heartbreak, the details that hardened into identity. But now you know what you didn't before. Everything you remember is built on a foundation you can never see. And the version of you doing the remembering, the narrator, the self that files experiences under my life, that self didn't always exist. It was constructed, slowly, in the silence of years you'll never get back, by a brain too busy growing to leave you a record of its own becoming.